Hello everybody. So I'm making this video about the Albin counter gambit. I hope this will be a learning experience, both for the viewers and for myself. It will be my chance to explain my understanding of the correct moves to make in a lot of the positions of the Albin counter gambit. Now, I'm not like a master or anything, so this is just my understanding, and people are welcome in the comments to say if you disagree or if you agree, if you like, if you don't like it. This is kind of a learning experience for me to understand the reasons behind all of the moves that I make. Okay, so starting off, the Albin counter gambit is when white plays the queen's gambit, we gambit the e pawn with e5. That's a gambit because white can just take the pawn. It's a true gambit because there's no way to win this pawn back, at least not right away. So what are we gaining from the pawn? We're losing a pawn, what are we gaining? So the first thing we're gaining is that when we play d4, so first of all, this is not, although white is gaining a pawn, this pawn is kind of hard to defend. First of all, it's a doubled pawn, so it's not necessarily a very good pawn. Also, it's very, very exposed. It's very far down in our territory. So it's a double pawn. It's hard to defend, and overall, we have a little bit of a better pawn structure. Just of the remaining pawns, we have a little bit of a better structure, and especially if we can win this pawn back, then we will definitely have a better pawn structure of the remaining pawns. The second thing is that we have a little bit of attacking potential with this bishop. Can come here and attack the king, the white king, and this bishop can sometimes team up with this pawn to deliver an attack, and we're going to look at a little bit later certain traps involving this bishop and this pawn. That's the second thing. And the third thing about this gambit is that in terms of the structure of the remaining pieces, is that it's a little bit hard for white to develop this knight because our pawn is here. Now, similarly, it's hard for us to develop our knight because of this pawn. So that's not necessarily an advantage that we have. It's just an interesting feature of the position. It's a little bit of an advantage, first of all, because this pawn is a little bit easier for us to win than this pawn is for white to win, because this pawn is this pawn is defended by our queen, and this pawn is very far away from the rest of white's action. But even that might not be true. But even if that's not true, the important thing is that we are probably a little bit more familiar with the position than white is. So in terms of our inability to develop this knight naturally, that's true. But if you play the Albin counter gambit a lot, then you will be used to that, and you'll know like how to deal with this knight. Whereas white, the Albin counter gambit is a pretty rare, or at least uncommon opening. So white probably doesn't face it that often, and so white might be a little bit more confused in terms of how to deal with developing this knight. So that's another possible advantage that we have. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at here is called the Lasker Trap. Now, the Lasker Trap, it comes from the Albin counter gambit. Now, generally, people don't actually fall for this trap, at least not in the intermediate level. But it's still good to know because sometimes the moves that people do make in the intermediate level are made specifically to avoid falling for this trap. Some of the moves that white can make. So it's good to know about this trap because it can help you understand the rationale behind some of white's moves. Anyway, the trap starts like this. White takes, white accepts the gambit, we play d4, and then white is annoyed by this pawn preventing the development of this knight, and so white immediately plays e3 to attack this pawn. Then we play bishop b4 check. White responds by blocking with the bishop. We attack we now take this pawn, and then white thinks they win a free bishop, so white takes this bishop, and then we take on f2. Now this is the trap, because at this point, if white takes this pawn, we win the queen. So white can't exactly do that. White obviously can't go here, that's check, so white will play king e2, so white's defending his queen. Then we take here, promoting to a knight, so white is in check. And then white will take the knight with the rook, and then we can play bishop here, again winning the queen. After the king moves, we win the queen. There's a few other variations here. So one variation is, suppose over here white does not take this knight and just brings his king back, trying to avoid losing the queen. So then we play queen out here, check, and if white blocks, we go here, and we're gonna win the rook. So that's another way the trap can go. Now, so backing up, if white does not want to fall into the trap, white can sometimes play like sort of the last ditch effort. The last point at which white can really avoid the trap is here. White can play knight d2. So that's kind of like, if sometimes you'll see if someone was about to fall for the trap and realized that at the last minute, they'll play knight d2. In that case, we can still take this pawn, and then that after that, at this point, we're still in a pretty good position. We have opened up this diagonal towards his king. We can bring our queen in attack, and his pawns are all messy, terrible pawn structure, all isolated and doubled. So he avoided the trap, but we're still in a pretty good position. Alright, so the next move I want to look at, after white accepts the gambit, is this move a3. And I decided to call this the anti-Lasker move because we just dealt with the Lasker trap, and the main point of this move a3 is it prevents the bishop from coming to b4. It prevents the Lasker trap. That's the main idea behind a3. So when white plays a3, we respond by developing our knight. Simple developing move. And then white will usually develop their knight. And then we're going to play this move, knight to e7. Now, knight to e7 is a very common move in a lot of these Albin counter gambit positions because the knight cannot come to f6. So it often comes to e7. And often the idea will be that after coming to e7, it's going to come to g6, and then it's going to be attacking this pawn. That's the trajectory of this knight. Now, another thing to realize about this position is that this pawn of ours on d4 is very weak. White can very easily win it. Aside from the fact that the knight and the queen are already attacking it, so it has two attackers and two defenders. Our knight and our queen are defending, but you know, if either one of our defenders moves away, then obviously it can be won. Also, it's easy for white to bring more pressure on this pawn. After playing a3, the point of a3 is not only to prevent bishop b4, it also, or no, this is not because of a3, but white can move this pawn up and bring the bishop out, and then the bishop will be attacking this pawn. He can also bring this knight, can come here, and can add another attacker that way. Another thing he can do is that I don't know how to get rid of these. Is that he can so pushing this pawn, aside from making way for this bishop to attack the pawn, he could also bring this pawn here and later bring his pawn all the way to b5 in the subsequent move, and that would undermine my knight being one of the defenders of this pawn. So there, you know, almost every piece here white can bring to play. White can go after this pawn. It could go after, white can go after this pawn with the knight and queen already going after the pawn. The bishop can come here to go after the pawn. The knight can come here, can go here and here, so the knight can go after the pawn. And this pawn can go after the pawn because it can undermine my knight. So I lost count how many pieces white has that all can be going after this pawn if white wants. So this d pawn is pretty weak. And basically the strategy of defending this pawn is not going to work if white chooses to go after it. There's not going to be a way to actually defend it. But what we can do is go after white's pawn, white's weak pawn. So that's kind of the idea, is that both white and black have a weak pawn, and it's not really possible to defend, so the only thing to do is to attack the other one. So to attack white's pawn. Okay. So in this position, white will often play e3. So now this d pawn is under attack, and now we can actually, in this case, so long term we might not be able to defend it, but we can over here defend it with bishop g4, or which pins this knight. So it defends it in the short term and also develops this bishop, pinning the knight. That's all I'm gonna say about this move a3, because we have a lot of other possible responses to cover. Alright, so the next move we're gonna look at after the gambit is accepted is this move knight f3. Now, knight f3 is actually the main move, and we're gonna do a bunch of different sections about knight f3, but in this case we're looking at knight f3. We respond knight c6. One idea behind knight f3, which is specifically to get the knight off of g1, because if you remember in the Lasker Trap, this pawn ends up taking on e3. It ends up taking here, and it ends up taking this knight. And the king is over here, and it promotes to a knight. So if the knight is not on g1 and instead is over here, then we can't take the knight. So that's one of the many ideas behind knight f3, is that it indirectly prevents the Lasker Trap, because the knight is no longer on g1. So when the knight comes here, first of all, it's attacking this pawn, so we defend it and develop at the same time. And then, so that, I mean, this is just a general main move. The thing we're looking at now is that what if white over here plays e3 to undermine this pawn? So it's the same idea as we had in the Lasker Trap, except now it's not possible because you know, our pawn can't take this knight because the knight's not here. Now, the thing is that even though he has avoided the technical Lasker Trap, it's still not a very good move, e3, and there still is another trap that white can fall into, due to the fact that white has a very messy pawn structure. So there's a way to trade into an endgame where the white's messy pawn structure is basically losing. And so this is how this works. This is a little bit of a more uncommon trap. It's not the famous Lasker Trap that everybody knows, so you might get more people falling into it. And then it doesn't involve making any particularly bad moves, right? It's never good to set a trap that involves making a bad move, because then if they don't fall into the trap, then you're lost. But that's not the case over here. This is another similar trap-ish sort of thing, but all of the moves that black makes are sound. So the way it works is you first continue as though you were playing the Lasker Trap. You bishop b4. Again, now so white's going to play bishop d2, thinking there's no issue anymore. You're going to take this pawn. And white is going to take on b4, thinking that there's no Lasker Trap because this knight is not not on g1, and there's no issue. But this is actually a mistake taking here. Now, first of all, notice it does not win a piece, because thanks to our knight we can take back. We're not going to take back right yet. We're going to take on f2. Again, it's similar to the Lasker Trap, almost exactly the same, except these knights are over here. That's the only difference. Again, white still cannot take this pawn because then he loses the queen. So white's going to play king e2. We're going to trade queens, because remember, as I said, the point is to get into an endgame where our superior pawn structure wins, so we need to trade queens to get into an endgame. And then we take this bishop. And this is basically the position. Now, the material is, well, technically we're up a pawn because we have 7 pawns and they have 6, but obviously this pawn is not going to stay ours. White's going to bring his king and win the pawn, but it takes time. It takes white time to do that. If white doesn't do that, then the pawn can get annoying in the future. So white does need to spend the time getting this pawn, and that's a few extra tempi that we have. So that's one advantage we have. Another advantage we have is that we do have much better pawn structure because both of these pawns are very overexposed. Another advantage we have is that this knight is a very powerful piece because it basically prevents white's king from moving it anywhere. Right, in an endgame, you usually want active kings, and if this king moves away, then the knight can come here and win the rook. So this knight is a very powerful piece. It's preventing the king from getting into the game, and it's developed, and white has no comparable piece. I mean, it has this knight, which is developed, but it's not serving such a important function. So, I mean, obviously, this knight can be attacked. It's not the best, but it is a very powerful piece. And according to the engine, black is like clearly winning in this position. At least in my engine here on Stockfish, it gives it black as like -2. It's like almost up a piece. So this is a sort of trap that white can fall into that's kind of like very similar moves to the Lasker Trap. But some people won't fall into the Lasker Trap, but they will fall into this. Now, how is white gonna avoid this trap? So this is a move 7. We said that on move 7, if white plays bishop takes on b4, then that's falling into the trap. Now, this is the most common move at this position in the intermediate level, but it's not the only move that gets played. Sorry, no, it's not the most common move in the intermediate level. It occasionally gets played, but it is not the most common move. At least even in the intermediate level, it's not the most common move. People, the most common move is to just take this pawn. So people don't usually fall into this trap, but it's fairly common, but it's not the only thing that happens, right? So normally they'll take the pawn, and that does not fall into this trap. But it still leaves black with an okay position. Right now, there's nothing better to do than just take this pawn. I mean, take this bishop. Trade the bishops. This is because this bishop is not going to have a very long and prosperous life. If we don't take this bishop, white can simply attack. White can attack the bishop with its pawn, and if we move back, it's going to attack the bishop again. So this bishop is not going to do much. And basically, you don't want it to be in a corner doing nothing. So sooner or later, it's going to have to take this bishop, so you might as well do it now. And then white will recapture with the queen or with the knight, and the game will continue. All right, next we're going to look at what happens if after accepting the gambit and playing knight f3, white decides at this point to play a3. So we previously looked at what happens when they play a3 right away. Now they're playing a3 and playing out the knight. So the idea behind playing a3 here is sort of to prevent our bishop from coming here, but the additional idea that white has is white's going to try to play b4. Whoops. So white's going to try to play b4. So this playing a3, it prepares b4. And after b4, white's going to play b5. And it's going to, pressure. White's going to have a lot of space on the queen side, and it's going to pressure our knight over here. So at that point, we want our knight to be able to move, and what we're hoping our knight's going to be able to do is going to be able to take this pawn. So right now the pawn is defended by white's knight. So what we want to do is we want to add another attacker to this pawn, so that we have two attackers and only one defender. So that's why we're going to play over here, knight to e7, preparing to bring the other knight here, and that way we're going to have two attackers on this pawn. Okay. At this point, white, as we said, will often play b4. Then we were going to play knight to g6. Now, as we said, if white attacks the knight, right now, if white attacks the knight right now, then we could just take the pawn. But no, white's not usually going to do this. White will at this point usually play bishop b2. And that is attacking our d4 pawn. So at this point, we're going to play a5. So why are we playing a5? Well, playing a5, it sort of protects our d4 pawn. Why does playing a5 protect our d4 pawn? Well, what happens if white decides to take the pawn here? Well, then we can take back. There can be a big trade. And at the end of the trade, we can take here. White can take back. We can trade rooks. And then we win white's pawn. So the whole thing doesn't actually win white a pawn, because at the end of the day, we win white's pawn back. So that and all that entire thing is only possible because we played a5, and that enables us to take this pawn here on b4. So, make a long story short, what a5 does is it, attacks b4, attacks white's pawn, so white can't simply take our pawn as white's now busy, or he can, but then we would be able to take back. So at this point, because white, can't be taking our pawn, instead it goes back to the other plan, which was to play b5. As we said, now we can take on f3. White will take on f3, and we will take on f3. Now, white will, at this point, often play e3 as a very common move. At this point, we do not want to take this pawn. First of all, it undefends our knight, and second of all, it leads to this queen trade that prevents us from castling. Now, so we do not want to take on e3. At the same time, this pawn of ours is attacked 3 times, and it's only defended once, and we can't save it by moving it. So white's attacking our pawn, and we can't really do anything about it. We can't take the e3 pawn. So instead of saving our pawn, we're going to attack one of white's pawns, which we will do with bishop to e6. And now we're doubly attacking this pawn, and it's only singly defended. White will take on d4. We will take on c4, moving our knight out of the way of the attack of this bishop. White will often play queen c2. We will play knight to d6, because now our knight is doubly attacked by the queen and the bishop. It needs to move out of the way. So we will move to d6. White plays bishop to d3, developing a piece, and also attacking this pawn, because it's only defended once, and it's now attacked twice. And now we're going to play queen to g5, not worrying about this pawn. Instead, we're going on the offensive, attacking one of white's pawns. And we're attacking this pawn here. And we're also attacking this pawn on b5. If white moves this bishop, then we're attacking the pawn on b5. Even if white does not move the bishop, we're attacking the pawn on b5, because we're attacking it with the knight and the queen. So it's doubly attacked. So we're going to win one of those 2 pawns. Okay, now let's back up a bit to move 6. Let's back up all the way. Let's review all the way. So we had d4, d5, knight f3, a3, knight e7. Alright, so we were doing when white plays b4 on move 6. And we said that that's the whole point of playing a3, is to enable people to play b4. Now, that's true, and that's why in the master level, b4 is the only move that, or at least by far the most popular move that gets played. But not all of our opponents are masters, so there are a bunch of other moves that sometimes get played here by white. Not that they're good, but they get played sometimes. So the first move that white will sometimes play in this position is e3. Now, we already discussed e3 a lot. e3 was the the Lasker Trap, and we also had e3 after knight f3. So this is something that gets played sometimes. White wants to play out the knight. They want to play a3, but then at the end of the day, they want to go back to playing e3 and trying to do something about our pawn here. All right, so we said taking on e3 is not good because that just helps white develop his bishop. And it also, not only does it help white develop the bishop, it also undevelops our knight. Because white does not have to take right away with the bishop. They could first take with the queen, and that brings our knight backwards. So taking on e3 is not good. Now, trying to defend our pawn with our knight is okay, and there are other scenarios where we will sometimes play this move knight f5 to defend our pawn. It's okay, but it's not the best move because this knight is a bit awkward on the square. Better is bishop g4. That just pins white's knight and therefore defends our pawn, because the knight is one of the two attackers of the pawn, or one of the three attackers, right? It's being attacked by these three pieces. It's defended by these two. So, whoops. Sorry, this was the position. So it's being attacked by three pieces, defended by two, and this undermines one of the three attackers. And in addition to defending the pawn indirectly and developing the bishop, the other good thing that this move does is it defends our queen with our rook. And it's always better if there's a queen trade to take back with our rook as opposed to the knight, as that, develops our rook as opposed to undeveloping our knight. So white will usually play bishop e2 is the most common move. Most of the times here I'm going based on what is the most common move on Lee chess. So bishop e2 breaks the pin. So now we're gonna take on e3, because now the queen trade benefits us, as we said, as it develops our rook. And then white will often go for the queen trade, which, as I said, is good for us. White will then take with the bishop. White wants to develop his bishop. And then we will take on f3 with our bishop. And the rationale here is that this knight is defending this pawn. So if we eliminate the knight, we can take the pawn. So even though, maybe bishops are usually better than knights, in this case it's fine to take. White will take back. And then we will take on e5. Now, you could say, well, that's not so great because, white now is attacking this pawn with his bishop. That's true. But then we're attacking this pawn with our knight. So, at the end of the day, that's good for us. Now, backing up again, trying to be a little bit comprehensive here. So we looked at b4, the move b4. We looked at the move e3 in this position. The other move that is sometimes played here is bishop to g5. And the idea here is to pin our knight. But this is not a very good move because we just play h6. And it just doesn't have much to do. So this is a move that is sometimes played, but you don't really have to worry about it because it's not really such a big deal. All right, next I'm going to discuss the main line. And, whoops, my board is the wrong way. Now, the main line in the Albin counter gambit, it's called the main line because in the master level, this is, the main line. It's by far the most common thing that gets played. Like, Ben Feingold has a video about the Albin counter gambit. It's like a 45-minute video. It's almost only discussing this main line. So if you have a book about the Albin counter gambit, or you watch some professional videos about it, this is what's going to be discussed. Kind of my video is what I'm trying to do in my video is discuss a lot of the sidelines that get played in the intermediate level, because the intermediate level people play a lot of different things. But this part, I'm not going to devote too much time to the main line, as there are tons of resources out there for the main line that you could look at. But I should talk about it somewhat because, first of all, it does get played somewhat on the intermediate level, and also, how could you not talk about the main line of the Albin counter gambit in the video about the Albin counter gambit? So let's get into it. So it starts with the gambit being accepted, the knights come out, and then white plays the move g3. And when white's playing g3, so that means they're going to fianchetto their bishop. So if they're fianchettoing their bishop, that means their bishop's not going to be defending this pawn, because their bishop's going to be here. So that means that this pawn is kind of going to be up for grabs. So we're going to play bishop e6, so we can try to win it, try to attack it. All right. White will often play knight to d2 to defend the pawn for now. Then we're shaping up to castle queen side, because our bishop's already out, our knight's already out, so the only thing left to bring out is our queen, and now we're ready to castle queen side. Now white brings out their bishop. We can't take this pawn because it's defended by the knight, so we castle. White castles. We play h5, which is going to give a space for a knight or a bishop to come here, right? It's going to support possibly a piece coming here. And this is basically the main line, right? So our plan is going to be to move our knight, and attack. Possibly, our plan's going to, sacrifice some pawns. Maybe we're going to bring our bishop here. Maybe we're going to, bring our other bishop. Maybe try to sacrifice our other bishop here to open up this line of our rook. That's basically the idea. And this is kind of why when people play the Albin counter gambit, a lot of times this is what they're aiming for, because it's a fun sort of attacking game with a lot of pieces in the mix. I played this a few times against a friend of mine, where I lost, because I made the mistake that I thought, look, it's opposite side castling, let me pawn storm. And it's true that you want to pawn storm often in opposite side castling, but you can't just pawn storm. First you gotta attack with your pieces, right? Your pieces need to be developed and in their correct squares. So I had the mistake of pawn storming now, when first, what you gotta do now is you gotta get your pieces. This knight needs to come into the attack. This bishop needs to come into the attack. Possibly this knight can be rerouted somewhere. And then you can go for the attack, and possibly by pawn storming. And it's a very sharp position, because white also is, can attack your here with his bishop. My king's kind of off to the side. I might need to play king b8. White's already got a pawn storm going with this pawn over here. So it's a position that requires you to be very, very careful. And it's an exciting position, which is normally good. At least my opinion is that when I'm playing chess, I like to play an exciting game where there's what to think about, not just like maneuvering Roy Lopez, where like you have to you know have tiny gains of if you gain a pawn and that ends the whole thing. It's more exciting when the game's not just about one pawn here, one pawn there. It's about the overall attack on the opposing king, and playing these kinds of positions helps you play these kinds of playing these kind of openings helps you play these kinds of positions whenever they come up. So this is like the main line of the Albin counter gambit. Good to know if you become a master. It'll be most of your games in the Albin counter gambit, but again, I want to cover more lines, because in the intermediate level, people play lots of different responses. All right. So in a lot of these lines, we have been discussing this plan of moving our knight here, and moving our knight back here to attack this pawn. And, moving our other knight here and attacking white's e-pawn with both of our knights. Now, we're going to discuss what happens if white does something similar. If white can use this knight and develop it here and go after our pawn. So that's what we're going to be discussing now. Okay, so starting with the main line, white here goes knight to d2. So we are going to start our general move. In general, we're going to play knight to e7. It's the most common move, continuing with our main plan of bringing the knight here. White's going to come here, knight to b3. And now we're going to play knight f5 to defend our pawn. And now you can ask, why don't we play knight g6 to attack white's pawn? We can. That's also a valid move. But the move we're going to be focusing on is knight f5 to defend our pawn. Now, there was in part 4, there was another time where we needed to defend this pawn, where we were able to defend it with our bishop by using our bishop to pin this knight. And that was kind of a better way to defend it, because then we also got to pin one of white's pieces, and also that our knight isn't on this awkward square. But that's obviously not possible now, because this pawn is still here. So if we brought the bishop to here, the knight wouldn't be pinned. So instead, we're going to play knight f5 and keep the defense. Okay, white plays e4. Then we're gonna take en passant, because basically there aren't really any good squares to retreat our knight, and so that's the disadvantage of bringing our knight to f5. It's a playable move. That's why we're discussing it, but what disadvantage to it, and why in the other scenario we would rather defend with the bishop, is that after this our knight is attacked, there aren't any great squares for it. So that's why instead of moving it away, we're just gonna take en passant. Okay. So then we have a queen trade. Then we have white taking on e3. And then we have g6. Now, the e-pawn, the e5 pawn, white's e5 pawn over here, is a weak pawn. And it cannot be defended by another pawn. And therefore, we are going to be able to attack it. And we're going to be able to attack it with, generally in these cases, it's good if we can attack it with lots of pieces, because that way, hopefully, we can attack it with more pieces than it can be defended but then can defend it. So this knight can come here to attack it. Our rook is going to be able to attack it, and hopefully our bishop can attack it too. And that's why we're going to try to fianchetto our bishop, rather than developing our bishop, somewhere out here. We're going to try to fianchetto it to add another attacker to this weak pawn. Okay, so that's why we're playing g6. Okay, white plays bishop d2, bishop g7, king f2, and castling, as I said, to bring more, to attack this pawn. Okay, that is that. Okay, so until now we have been discussing what to do when white accepts the Albin counter gambit, meaning when white takes on e5. And according to the Lichess database, master level games, white accepts the gambit in 90% of master games. And therefore it's no surprise that when you, in most videos that I have seen, at least on the internet, about the Albin counter gambit, they focus exclusively on the Albin counter gambit accepted, and my guess would be that most books would also focus on that, because that is what gets played in the master level, and therefore that's the theoretical the theoretical line. However, in the intermediate level, from what I have seen in the database, is that it's only accepted 2/3 of the time. And therefore, as an intermediate level player, such as myself, and I assume most of my viewers, we want to study some lines in the Albin counter gambit declined, because we want to be prepared for what our opponents are likely to play. And declining the Albin counter gambit is not like a bad move, right? I mean, it might not be the most 100% optimal move, but it's not losing by any stretch of the imagination. So it's a reasonable, declining the gambit is a reasonable move that your opponents are likely to play. Therefore, I think it behooves us to learn some of those lines. So first we're going to discuss when white declines it with the move e3. Okay, so then we're going to take on d4. And we're not taking the c pawn because we don't want to help white develop his bishop, right? If we take the c pawn, he would recapture with the bishop. We kind of have to take something, because if we don't, white's just going to take our e pawn, and we can no longer really push on d4, because then he's just going to take our pawn. It's like he played e3 preemptively, and we don't have any of our tricks anymore because he did it a turn early. So basically we have to take a pawn, and we don't want white to develop his bishop, so we just have to take on d4. All right, so now white has to take back, and white can take back with either the pawn or the queen, so we're going to look at both. So first, let's say white takes back with the pawn. Okay, so then we're going to play knight to f6. Now, the knight f6 is not the only move that you can play in this position, but knight f6, I like moves that follow general principles, because it is good to get in the habit of following general opening principles. It's opening principle to develop knights before bishop, and it's also generally considered better to develop your king side before your queen side, as that enables you to castle. These are obviously not hard and fast rules, but it's a good general principle to be in the habit of. In this position, I don't see any huge advantage one way or the other to which knight to develop first, so might as well do this one. Okay. All right, knight f6. Now, white. Okay, what's white gonna play? So white can play knight f3. White can play bishop e7, or white can play knight c3. Let's look at knight c3. It almost doesn't matter what white plays. It's going to do the same thing. So then we're going to play bishop e7 just to prevent any checks along the e-file. And if white had played any of those other moves, we could have also played bishop e7. Right? White could play now knight f3. We're going to castle. Again, if white played out his bishop, we also could castle. All right. Now let's say white plays his bishop. Now we're going to take on c4. And it's less of an issue. We said we don't want to take on c4 before because we don't want to help him develop his bishop. Well, now he already spent a tempo developing his bishop, so it's not as big a deal to force him to waste another tempo on the bishop. All right, so now this is the position, and okay, white has an isolated d pawn, and other than that, the game is kind of equal. Fine. So that we said we're going to look at if white takes with the pawn or the queen. So that was if he takes with the pawn. Now what if he takes with the queen? Okay, so then we're going to play knight c6. And, okay, knight c6, it attacks the queen. But it also prepares the knight to come to b4 and then to come to c2 where it would win the rook. So those are the dual ideas of moving the knight to c6. So white plays queen takes on d5. So, right, playing knight to c6, it looks like it loses a pawn because white can just take the pawn here. Then we can take his queen. He can take our queen, and then we can play knight to b4. So that's why it doesn't really lose the pawn, because our knight is now threatening to come in here, and it's also threatening to win this pawn. So white has to play knight a3 to defend this square. And then we can we could take the pawn, or we could play knight f6, which attacks the pawn again. So we have a little bit of a lead in development, and white's knight is a bit awkwardly placed. So we're down a pawn, but it's fine. Okay, next we're going to discuss what happens if white declines the gambit by taking a pawn, right? Accepting the gambit is to take this free pawn that we offered on the e-file. But white can instead choose to take the pawn on the d-file. And that is a not free pawn because it's defended by the queen. So when white does this, we're going to just take back with the queen. We're not going to be like white and take this pawn, right? Because this pawn is not free, and then white can take back with his queen. We're not going to try to do that would be anything like that. We're just going to take the pawn that was offered to us and develop our queen. Okay. So now, in this position, there are 4 moves that get played by white. So we're going to go through all of them. Okay, 4 common moves that get played. Okay. All right, so option number 1 is that white will play knight f3. So this is attacking our pawn. And then we are going to respond by taking white's pawn. Now, why are we taking white's pawn? Well, white wants to play knight c3. And if white can play knight c3, that will force our queen to go backwards. And when we take white's pawn, that makes knight c3 a little bit harder to play. It doesn't make it impossible, because if white were to play knight c3, we can't take his knight because our queen is pinned. But we can move our queen, and then he would have to move his knight. So taking white's pawn over here kind of preemptively takes, in the future, will take that tempo away. Obviously, white can choose to take back the pawn because it would be defended by the queen, but if white doesn't want to do that, white wants to play knight c3, which is often what white wants to do. So taking the pawn makes that a little bit harder. Now, additionally, the reason why I want to take is that there's not much else we can do. Since our pawn is in danger, right, and we need to do something about it. If we were to try to play e4, then that's not very good, because this pawn is now going to be lost, basically. It's only defended by the queen. It's way over in our opponent's territory, and it's going to be very easy now for our opponent to put the pressure on this pawn and win it. So it's very overextended. Conversely, white's d-pawn is defended twice, and it can easily be defended with e3. So white's pawn is kind of more of a positional like stronghold than our pawn, because it can be defended. Our pawn cannot. So it makes sense to get rid of our pawn that is probably going to be lost anyway, and take white's pawn. Okay, and as we said, white will usually want to play knight c3 here. White wants to develop a piece while also winning a tempo on our queen. So then we play bishop b4. That way we can develop a piece, preventing white from taking, obviously, because we're pinning the knight. So it enables us to develop a piece while pinning the knight. Okay, so now this point white will usually take on d4, and then we will take on d4. We kind of have to take white's queen, because white's queen is threatening our bishop, and it's also threatening to win our rook. So we kind of have to, we can't just like retreat our queen, because then, and of course it's also attacking our queen. So if we just retreat our queen, he'll take one of the other things. The only thing you can imagine doing, the only other thing you can imagine doing is checking him, because obviously that prevents his queen from doing anything. That doesn't really help, because after the or he could even take back like this, and now white's attacking this pawn, and there's no way to defend both of them. So checking delays the inevitable. White is still going to win one of our pawns, at least. So that's why when white takes our pawn, we just have to go for the queen trade. We don't have much of a choice. So, okay. Then white will take our queen. And then we're going to play knight f6. Now, why is knight f6 better than knight c6? Oftentimes, these two are kind of interchangeable. But in this case, knight c6 is actually a bad move. And it's important to understand why. So, knight c6 leads to the following. Leads to white playing knight b5, attacking this pawn. And since now our knight's over here on c6, it can no longer come to a6 to defend. We have to play bishop a5. We have to defend this pawn with our bishop now. But then white can add another attacker to it. And, we don't have any good way to keep defending it. We could try with our king, but then white can check our king. So that's kind of leads to a bit of a bad situation. So that's why we're playing knight f6. Okay, and now it's not a big deal if white chooses to attack our pawn here. we can defend with this knight, and we can defend with our other knight. So now it's less of an issue. So that's why knight f6 is the better move in this case. Okay, so we said there's 4 options for how white responds here. So we said knight c3 was the first of the 4. Second of the 4 is that white's just going to go for the queen trade right away. All right, so in this case, we're going to play knight f6 as that defends our queen and develops a piece. All right, it's usually better to play developing moves than just blindly going for trades. All right, so then white's going to play knight c3, attacking our queen again. So we play queen a5. Again, there's no need to trade queens. It doesn't accomplish anything to trade queens. And a5, our queen is doing a lot. First of all, it's on this completely open file here, and the rank, the 5th rank, is completely open, so it can easily get from one place to the other, and it's also pinning one of white's pieces. So it's a perfectly good square on a5. So no need to trade queens when we can place our own queen on a good square. All right. Okay, going back. Right, so we discussed knight f3. Okay, next move we're gonna discuss here is knight c3. I think I said there are 4 options for move number 5, but I forgot. This one is I guess another option for move number 4. Knight c3. So white can attack our queen right here. And if white does this, then we just get a free pawn. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a good move by white. And it moves our queen out of danger and wins a free pawn. So then white will often trade queens. Knight b5, going after our pawns. We'll play knight a6 defending. White will take this pawn. And now it looks like white gained the pawn back, but we are now a tempo up as black, right? Because it's our turn. We both have one piece developed and it's our turn. So it looks like white gained a pawn, but actually we have more than equalized. So it's good for us. So, okay, bishop b4 as check, as that will prevent white from castling. White defends. We exchange, preventing white from castling. We'll play c5, gaining space with tempo. All right. Okay, going backwards. All right, that was the second. Okay, so we discussed here in this position, knight f3, knight c3. The next thing we're going to look at is e3 in this position. All right, so white plays e3. We're going to take on d4, as we have here a pawn that's going to be isolated. We're trading an isolated pawn for a protected pawn, and leaving white, if white takes back, leaving white with an isolated pawn. So that is good for us. And we'll play knight c6, adding even more pressure to white's isolated pawn. Okay. All right. The next move that we're going to look at from this position is d takes on e5. And then if white does that, we're just going to queen trade, as that prevents white from castling. And we'll play knight c6, attacking white's pawn. All right, so the last move we're going to look at here that white can respond to the gambit with is this move knight c3. Now, when white plays knight c3, we're going to take on d4. Now, other moves are possible here. for black. However, taking on d4 does something good, because what it does is it forces white to bring his queen out early to take back our pawn. And this allows us to continuously attack the queen while developing, and, you know, forcing white to keep moving his queen. And it can set up a position where if white doesn't play accurately, we can win a piece. So to me, that's a good way of playing, even if there are other ways of playing too. So starts by playing knight c6, attacking white's queen. So then white's gonna often take here on d5. White thinks it's a free pawn here, and it is, right? So I mean, so basically now, you know, the position's about equal. All right, then we're gonna move out our bishop, developing our bishop while attacking the queen. So again, sort of attacking with tempo. Now, white will often want to trade queens here, but again, this gives us a tempo because it helps us develop our rook. Okay, now, you know, we have our developed bishop, a developed knight, and a developed rook. So even though we're not necessarily up material and we're down material, we are very well developed. Now, this is the position where white usually makes a big mistake. White will often, in this position, play e3. It's a common move in the intermediate level. It's a reasonable looking move, as it you know, defends this pawn that's under attack from our bishop. So white, you know, wants to open up his own bishop and also develop defend this pawn. But this is a very bad move, e3. It enables us to play knight to b4. You know, with our developed pieces, we can now move them. We play knight to b4, and now we're threatening to move our knight into c2 and win his rook. All right, so white cannot move his white will, in this position, will often move his sorry, what's the right? Rook c1 is rook b1 is the common move in this position, as white wants to prevent this fork from happening, doesn't want to prevent his king from castling, so we'll play rook b1. But when this happens, we can play knight c2 anyway. Playing rook b1 doesn't actually prevent it. And then white will be forced to move his king. And then we'll be able to take this pawn. The king will have to come backwards. There's all these squares are covered by the rook and the knight. The king will have to move out here, and we're going to win the bishop. So this is a very common thing that happens. This position has happened many times in the Lee chess database, so it's good to know it in case white plays this way. All right, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to leave any comments that you have about the video or about the Albin counter gambit in general, and I hope that you found this enjoyable and can maybe use this in some of your games.